Today's daf is daf Yud Dalid, 14 in Kiddushin, and we are at the last line actually of Yud Gimel Amud Bet. We talked about how a person marries and disentangles a marriage from a regular wife, a sort of usual case. One second. There goes Rosa. Okay,
I think you're supposed to stop the recording and restart it.
What do you mean? You can't hear me?
No, I think in order to keep it, because it's been recording, you're supposed to stop it and then restart it, according to David Schwartz.
Okay, how do you do that?
Oh, I don't know.
I could leave and go. I don't know how to do that. Sorry. Let's just get started. Let's go.
Okay.
Okay. So anyway, so we talked yesterday about a regular wife, and then we got to the Mishnah about a Yavama. The Yavama is a special case of a wife, obviously, because Yavama was married to someone's brother. The brother died without children. There's what's called a zika, a connection between that woman and the brothers or brother, let's say. And but that's not marriage, right? You have to consummate that marriage. So the Mishnah said Yavama nikneit b'bi'ah. The only way to acquire Yavama is through sleeping with her, and the way that she leaves that is either through chalitza or mitat hayavam, or if all the brothers die, then she becomes free to marry anyone she wants, I guess, except for a Kohen Gadol maybe. Says Gemara, bottom of your Gimel Amud Bet, b'bi'ah min alan. How do you know that a Yavama can be acquired, that the marriage can be finalized through bi'ah? Amar Kra, turn the page, I gotta doing this on the computer here. Amar Kra Yavamo Yavo Alam. Pasuk says Yavama sleeps with her, and the next step is Lekacha Lo Liishai, therefore takes her to be his wife. So you see that sleeping with her is the mechanism in which you take her to be your wife. It says maybe it's saying that she's like a regular wife, meaning that you can give her money, you can give her a star, or you can sleep with her. How do you know she's only that one way? That doesn't really make sense. The Tanya, as the Braita said, you might have thought that when about a yivama, that kesef, money or star or gomer kedersha bia gomer, just like bia works. Tamulomar, therefore it says v'yibma. It says v'yibma, and it's mashma only bia. Bia gomeret ba v'in kesef star gomrim ba. The only thing that can complete that marriage, right, which is a zika currently, is bia, sleeping with her, and not the other ways that you would marry a regular woman. Well, maybe that's not what. Maybe my ema my v'yibma the bal karcha, right? Maybe the yibma is telling you something else. Not telling you have to sleep with her. It's telling you that you can do it even against her will, meaning that you bal karcha miyabim. Sorry, you can be miyabim even if she doesn't agree to it. She doesn't have a choice, right? That's if her brother was married, which of course was a huge consideration when you marry someone. You have to think about who their brother was, right? But how do you know that that yibma means that? It tells you both. Shma mina tarti. So you can learn both. So that's how we learn both things from the word yabam. Then we said that we're now 7 lines from the top, 2 dots. How do we know that a woman leaves yibum through chalitza? So it says the Mishnah b'chalitza askmar minalan. How do you know that? Because the Torah says, obviously, we've all recently had the parsha of Yivama. It says v'nikra shmo b'Yisrael. Once you've done this process, you call the man b'Yisrael Beit Chalutanal, the house of the shoe that was chalutz, that was taken away, right, removed. Kivan shechalatz ba. Now, once you remove the shoe, putra l'chol Yisrael. She is then permitted to marry all Yisrael. So that's why it implies you announce this woman is now free, right? Otherwise, why are you announcing it? So you're announcing it to imply that now that this woman who's shomeret yavam did chalitza, she's free to all Yisrael. This is more, whoa. Highly Yisrael lachidata. Is that what we learn from Yikra Shmo Yisrael? Haimi Boili Tani Shmo Rabbi Yehuda. Shmo Yehuda said, Yisrael tells you that specifically you have to do this only in a Beit Din of Yisrael, right? It has to be a Beit Din Shel Yisrael, lo Beit Din Shel Avdei Kochavim, which of course is very problematic because who in the world would have thought you could do it in a Beit Din Shel Avdei Kochavim? Rashi here says something very fascinating, which is also a big debate, that the Girsa should be Beit Din Shel Gerim, that a Beit Din of converts who are obviously Jews for every purpose, But as we've seen before, in some halachic circumstances, especially when you're talking about yichus and things that go back, many generations, we don't allow kerim to be the form of this beit din, potentially because it involves, connecting to generations and going back. Of course, very ironic because the whole first case of Ibam happened, as we know, with Gerim, right, with roots. So anyways, but that's the difference in the gear. So we have Ovdeko Chavim, the Bach changes it like Rashi does to Gerim. Either way, we use the word Yisrael for that. Enters the Gemara, Trey be Yisrael TV. It says the word Yisrael twice, once to tell you that she's free to marry anyone once she's done Chalitza, and the second one is to tell you that it has specifically done with the special Beit Din of Yisrael. I asked the Gemara about Kati Mibayli Kedetanya, but what about the following Breita? Rabbi Yehuda, there's a very important Breita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, I was once, I would say, were sitting in front of Rabbi Tarfon, Ubata Yivama Lachlot, and the case came in front of the Beit Din, and Yivama came and she didn't want to marry the brother didn't want to marry her, and he did Chalitza. Rabbi Tarfon said to us, Talmidim sitting there, Anu kulchem va'amru, you should all respond out loud and say, now let's quote, Chalutza now, Chalutza now. So everyone is supposed to reply. It's like a call and response. So that's when it says Yikra Shemo Yisrael. It doesn't mean she should necessarily be free to marry anyone in Israel. It means that all people sitting there are supposed to call out, this has happened. This has happened. That's why you're right. That is true. That's halacha, but that is from the Vav, the Nikra Shemo Nafka. The Vav is extra, but remains extra Yisrael to tell you that she's permitted, once you've done Chalitza, to marry anyone in Yisrael. And the final thing we said in the Mishnah is that a Shomeret Yavam becomes mutar to marry anyone she wants, b'mitat hayavam. If the man who was waiting to do Yibam dies, so he doesn't exist anymore, so then she can marry anyone she wants. Says the Gemara, how do you know that? Minalan. This Gemara, it's Kal v'chomer. This we learn, we're going to have several of these going forward, so try to keep it all straight. I'm going to go quickly, but stop me if I scream out, if I go too fast. But it's a Kal v'chomer. Thank you. And the Kal v'chomer members, we have to look at a woman who's Eshet Ish, a regular married woman, and a Yavama. Says the Gemara, what's the Kal v'chomer? Ma Eshet Ish. A regular woman who's married, if a man sleeps with her, or she sleeps with someone, they're chayiv and chenek. She chenek, right? But she's very, very serious. Someone sleeps with her, they chayiv mita. But if her husband then dies, mitata bal matirata, everyone who wants can marry her, who is appropriate. But Yavama, remember, Yavama doesn't have a husband. Her husband died. She's supposed to marry the Yavam. If she marries somebody else, sleeps with somebody else, she's chayiv lotase, not even mita. So Yavama, whose connection is only she belav, lo kol shekain, that if that person dies, she becomes permitted because it's not as strong in Isser. That's an interesting Kal v'chomer. But there's something very unique about an Eshet Ish. Mal Eshet Ish can yotza beget. An Eshet Ish can get rid of that connection by divorce. But Yavama can't have divorce. Now we're going to ask in a middle bit. Maybe she could, right? The Tomer Bezush and yotza beget. Well, she doesn't go out with a get, but she goes out with chalitza. That's like a get, right? Hanami yotza bechalitza. Ella, what's the difference is Mal Eshet Ish shekain osra matira. Eshet Ish is very unique because the person who made her usher, her husband, if he dies, she becomes mutter. But by Yavama, the husband made her usher. He's dead, right? So it's not a question of his death. It's the brother's death. But since the brother is not the one who caused her to be usher, it was the living brother. It was the original husband. Therefore, it's a little bit harder to take away that connection. So Mali Yavama, lost it again. But Ma Temar Bezu, sorry. You don't say the same thing about this one, about a Yavama. She'eno Yotzav, sorry, skip. Mali Sheshken Yesh Shekain Osra Matira. Amar Vashi, no. Hanami Osra Matira. No. If you think about it, by this woman too, the person who made her Usr is her Yavam, right? Because if there was no Yavam, she wouldn't be Usr. Yavam Osra, Yavam Sharila. The only reason she's prohibited is because her husband died. If her husband died, she'd be permitted to marry anyone she wanted if there wasn't a brother. But the existence of the brother makes her usher. She's a shomeret yavam. So why don't we have a kal v'chomer? That just like that isser is not so extreme, right? Because it's only a lotase. If her husband, where the isser was nita, dies, she becomes permitted. If the yavam dies, why doesn't she become permitted, right? So why don't you say that from a kal? I mean, not why don't you? That's the answer. Why we say it from a kal v'chomer, and that's how we know that if the yavam dies, she becomes permitted. Okay, says the Gemara 1 second. I got to go backwards now and have another kal v'chomer. Why don't you say Why don't you say that if you do chalitza to your wife, not your yavam, she should become permitted? Why can't chalitza be an alternate form of get? And right, obviously it's not a very nice thing, but maybe they're not in a great relationship. They don't have a get. Let them do chalitza, take off the shoe and spin and do the whole process by a regular eshetish. And why don't we say it permits her from a kal v'chomer? What's the kal v'chomer? Ma yivama. Cheno yotza beget. Yivama cannot be permitted if the Shemeret Yavam writes a get, it doesn't mean anything. Well, we learned in Yavamis that does mean Drabanan, but Midoraita means nothing. But she's Yotza b'chalitza, but a chalitza severs the connection. Zu, an Eshetish, Yotza beget, Enodin she Yotza b'chalitza. It's a great kal v'chomer, but there's a pasuk, Amar Kra, Sefer Kritut, v'katav la Sefer Kritut, which we learn, Rashi learns from the connection of the word Sefer to Kritut. Sefer Korta, only thing that can cut off her connection to her husband, her ex-husband soon to be, is a text, is a sefer. Ein davar achar korta, nothing else will cut her off except, of course, his death. It says, okay, but I got a new kal v'chomer. We are, I don't know, around 2/3 of the way down. The heyavama yotza beget mi kal v'chomer. Why don't we turn it around and say that a get should work by yavama, from a kal v'chomer, from an eshetish. Ma eshetish. Just like a married woman, shein yotza b'chalitza, right? We just said Sefer Korta, only a get works. Chalitza does not work for a regular married woman, but she's Yotza beget. Zu Yavama, she Yotza bechalitza, and didn't she Yotza beget? Why don't you say kal v'chomer that she should use the get? Amar Gra kacha. It says kacha ye'aseh li'ish, right? This is what you should do, and the word kacha means do it this way, like you tell your children, right? Why kacha? This is the way you do it. It's not negotiable. So therefore, when the Torah says the word kacha, you can't make a kal v'chomer and say, let's do it a different way. Kacha ikuva. Is that really true? Just because your parents or your Torah in this case says, do it this way, you can't say a kal v'chomer. What about a very unrelated case, but we're going to see where the Torah says, do it this way, and the Braita came along and said, but what about a kal v'chomer? Just do it another way. And what's that case? Yom Kippur. Hayom HaKippurim, it says that you make a goral. Remember, right? You take two seirim, two goats, you stand them up. One is a goral la Hashem, one is la Azazel, right? And it says after the goral, the word chukah. Do it this way. So you would think that means you have to do it this way. The Braita is about to say, what about from a kal v'chomer? We'll learn out that you could do it a different way. So you see clearly that a kal v'chomer could override where the Torah says do it this way, which is why we're bringing this question. Let's read the Braita, the Tanya. We have a Braita. It says, the asahu chatat. You make the sa'ir into a chatat. Says the Braita, hagorel oseh chatat. It's made, right? It's passive. It's not you make it. Asahu, it's made into a chatat. The goral, the lot, is what makes it into a chatat. Ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. Calling it, saying, this one's a chatat, this one's azazel, that's not what happens. Shiyachol, you would have thought halodina. You would have thought it's a kal v'chomer. Ma b'makom shel kidesh hagoral. In a place where a goral wouldn't work. Let's say you have a regular karban, right? Oh wow, you got all overskins here. Let's say you have a regular karban, and you have to bring a woman who's a yoledet. We had yesterday. She brings a chatat and an olah. She separates two animals. She's like, I can't decide. This one's really cute. I can't decide if I want to bring the really cute one for the chatat or the really cute one for the olah. They're both going to be killed and put on the mizbeach. But I don't know which one I want to do. So therefore, what do? She says, I'll take lots. Whichever one, I'll throw the coin, whichever one it lands on will be a chatat. That has no impact. You have to announce, this is a chatat, this is an olah, or the coin can decide, right? But a goral does not work. But in that case where a goral does not work, you still can say, I want this to be a chatat, I want this to be an olah. Let me read the kal v'chomer. Hello, Dinu. Now that we're around 10 or 11 lines from the bottom of Yud Daled Amid Aleph in Kiddushin. Ma b'makom shel kidesh hagoral. In a place where the goral is not mikadesh an animal, but kidesh Hashem, but using the name, saying this should be a karban works. How about in Yom Kippur? Makom shekidesh hagoral in Yom Kippur, where the goral works. Eno din shekidesh Hashem. right? You should be able to just walk over to the animal and say, I want this to be the Sa'ir Lashem. I want this to be the Sa'ir Lazazel. Either way, says the Braita Tamalomer Va'asahu Chatat. It is made into a Chatat. Hagorelo se Chatat, Vein Hashem se Chatat. Okay. Now, the point of that Braita has nothing to do with us, because we're not talking about Yom Kippur here. But the point is that even though the Torah says do it this way, the Braita comes along and says, but I have a Kal V'chomer to do it another way. So you see that even where the Torah says ikuva, do it a certain way, a Kal V'chomer may override that. I'll speak that in the Gemara. Uma, I can find it. Haima, there we go. The reason, the reason you can't announce that your animal should be a Sa'ir Lashem is the Torah says don't do it. Halav hachi darshin Kal V'chomer. If it hadn't said that, we would have made a Kal V'chomer. Afagav dichtiv bechuka, even though it says the word chuka. So you see, the fact that Torah says, now going back to chalitza, right? The fact that Torah says do a chalitza is not enough to exclude you from doing it another way. Amar Gra, you're right. But it says the word la, right? It says the word by get. It says the word la v'lo liyivma, that you can divorce her, meaning her, a wife, but not a yivama. I ema la lishma. Maybe the word la is telling you, remember, you have to write a get for your wife. It has to be for her specifically, not for anybody else. Well, trey la ktivi. It says the word la twice, once to exclude yivama, and once to say it has to be written specifically for that woman. But still, we need the two words la. Chad la lishma. One to tell you, write a get for your wife lishma, your ex-wife to be. Vedich la lo la l'chaverta. You can't write a get that works for a woman and her partner, right? Remember, we had this whole case where you had a wife, two wives who had the same name, right? You can't write a get even though it's the same name. Says the word, well, you're right, but el amakra now. The pasuk says the word now by a yavama, implying now in midiachinalo. It's an extra word. It says you have to use a shoe. You can't use a get. I behind now lachidat. Is that what you use the word now? Hami boile. If you recall from Yevamot, or if you joined Daf Yomi after Yevamot, we're going to learn it for the first time on the wide line here. The Kidditanya, the writer says na'alo. Right? You take na'alo, which means his shoe. Says the Braita, I only know it has to be his shoe. And now she'll call adam in LA. How do I know it can be a shoe that belongs to somebody else? Talmulomar now, right? Now is riba. It can be any shoe. In Cain says, well, you're right. This is the Braita. Why do you say his shoe? To tell you, although it doesn't have to own the shoe, it has to fit. The shoe has to fit. Na'alo hara'uila. Prat l'gadol she'en yachol halochba. If the shoe is 5 sizes too big and you can't walk in it, then it doesn't count for chalitza. Or prat lekatan she'en chofeh baror raglo. If it's such a small sandal that doesn't even cover most of his foot, then it doesn't count. Or prat le misulim, daf yud dalad amabet, if it excludes misulim, a shoe that's called misulim. I don't have an English here, but I will find one though, which Rashi always explains. Well, the Gemara continues and says, she'ein lo akev, it has no heel, right? It's some kind of sandal that has no heel.
Steinsaltz actually has a picture of an example of that from Roman.
Okay,
it's basically a leather flip-flop.
So those things don't work. In Cain, lichtov kra, now. Could have just said the word now without the hey. My now, han now, shmami natarti. So we learned 2 things from the word now. One is that it has to be a shoe that fits. And the second is that the only way to do chalitza, or to divorce basically a shomeret yavam, is through chalitza, not through get. And that is the end of the first Mishnah of Kiddushin. So 14 pages later, we got done with that Mishnah. Okay?
Good review of yesterday's Torah reading, or part of it.
Yes, and several of the psukim are from yesterday. Continues the Gemara now. So it's a new start for Evi and Nava over there in Israel. From Daf Yudalad Amabet, the next Mishnah in Kiddushin. So the first Mishnah talked about how you are koneh, how you engage in a marriage, and how you extract yourself from that marriage, right? Gittin and Kiddushin. The second Mishnah talks about another way that you acquire things, not a wife, but a slave, okay? A slave in some ways is similar because especially a female slave involves some similarities to marriage. Sure, this is about a male also, But there are different ways to be Koneh and Eved. And says our Mishnah, there's many different categories of Avadim, right? You have to remember back to Mishpatim for this. But there are many different categories of Avadim. One category, says the Mishnah on the third line, is an Eved Ivri, right? A regular Eved Ivri. We're going to see there's no one case. There's going to be several cases of Eved Ivri. But one case of Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, Nikne Bekesef Ubishtar. An owner acquires that slave by giving him money. Or remember, one mechanism to become a slave is if you steal from somebody else, right? So you run out of money, the Beit Din then would give the money to the person you stole from, right? But the new owner, the owner would give money in exchange for this Eved or Bishtar, or you can write a document, right? But not obviously the third way. And B'koneh atzmo b'shanim u'biyovel u'bigaraon kesef. The three ways an Eved can be koneh himself is through years, right? Usually it means Shemitah, 6 years, the pasuk says. Or Yovel, if let's say Yovel happens before 6 years, is one answer. Or if the person agreed to stay more, Yovel ends it. Or Giraon Kesef. Let's say the person gets enough money to redeem himself, right? The owner bought him for $100 for 5 years, which is $20 a year. He comes up with $20, he can go home a year early. That is a male slave. Yitera alav, additional mechanisms by Amaha Ivriya, by a female slave. Shekana et atzmo b'simanim. Female slave here specifically means a young girl who's below the age of 12, who is sold by her father as a slave. The father gets the money. The woman becomes a slave. She is only a slave until she becomes an adult. Once she has simanim, she goes free. Okay? Or yovel, right? Or all the other things can happen before that. So that's extra. Hanirtza, now a person who became a slave and at the end of 6 years said, I want to stay on and be a slave, right? So remember the owner bangs a hole in their ear at the door, right? That person is nikneh b'ritziyah. The action of banging that hole in their ear is how they're kona for another period of time. And kona tatzmo b'yovel v'mitata adon. This is a fascinating halacha, which I don't think we're going to get to today, that a person who's nirtza is only a slave to that individual, not to their children, right? So if a person says, I love, remember the pasuk says, ahafti et adoni, right? I love my master. He continues, says my children, whatever, but I love my master and I want to stay on for longer. So if that person agrees to it, they remain a slave till Yovel, but if the master dies, they go free. It doesn't go to the family like we might think with other slaves, and we're going to discuss that in the Gemara. So those are all the mechanisms. It says the Gemara, the first one we have to learn is Eved Ivri Nikneh B'Kesef. You can acquire a Jewish slave through money. Minalan. How do you know that? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says that when you go free, you get Mikesef Miknato, from the money that you use to buy it. Milamed Nikneh B'Kesef. You see clearly that you buy them with kesef. Okay, that's pretty clear. Says the Gemara, Ashkechan Eved Ivri Hanimkar Lo Oved Kochavim. Right? I understand an Eved Ivri who is sold to a non-Jew. Very interestingly, the Torah very clearly, this was recently we had this, right, talks about selling a Jew to a non-Jew and having legal halachic authority. Remember, the pasuk talk says you should try to redeem your brother who's sold, etc. Now, says Rashi, we think that stam kinyanim, regular agreements with a non-Jew, happen through money. And regular agreements with the Jew happen through kinyan, through picking it up, through meshicha, right? So I might have thought that kesef is only true by, I'll read it again inside, Ashkon Eved Ivri, Hanimkar Lo Oved Kochavim, that it works that you can use money, Hol V'Kol Kinyano B'Kesef. Because in general, non-Jews, the way we relate to them is through money. But Nimkar Li Yisrael Minol, and how do you know this applies to a Jew who's sold to another Jew? Makra V'Hefda, Torah says you redeem that person. Melamed Shemigraat Pidyonav Yotza, which means that you basically prorate the pidyon. So again, if he sold for $100 for 5 years, till Yovel, it means $20 a year, and the Eved can pay back and get rid of his responsibility by redeeming himself. So that is how you see Eved who's a Jew. Says the Gemara, well, Ashkechan Ama Ivriya. Now go to the next case, right? And I'll summarize this at the end. But you see, says Gemara, we found by an Ama Ivriya. Again, Ama Ivriya means a Jewish girl who is sold as a slave, right? So that woman, Hoel Mikadsha Bikesef, Mikanya Bikesef. Since if you wanted to marry her, you would, as we learned in our first Mishnah, marriage happens through Kesef. So maybe buying her as a slave, which is a step almost of marriage, because very often the person who bought her would have the right to sleep with her, right? Not very often. That was always the case, almost. Well, not always, but almost. You might think he could be koneh her with kesef. But Eved Ivri Minalan, how do you know the same is true about a man who doesn't get married through kesef? Markra, therefore, there's another pasuk that says, Ki macher lecha achicha ivri, if you are sold to you, your brother who's a Jew, o ha'ivriya, right? Or a woman slave. And then the avatcha sheishanim. So there's a hekesh in this pasuk between a man and a woman. Makish ivri livriya. So we compare the male slave to a female slave. And so therefore, anything that works by one works by the other. And so now we've learned basically that you use money can be used to buy a slave if you're not Jewish. Remember, a non-Jew buying a Jewish slave. Or you can use money to buy a male or female slave. But there's two ways to buy a slave. And this is very important in the ongoing dapin. One way is if a person, as the pasuk says, a person steals from somebody else, right? They steal money, they have no way to repay. Beit Din sells that person as a slave to pay off their debt, right? That's one way. Another way is if, let's say, a person is just like, I can't live life. I don't have enough money. I can't afford to support my family. I'll go and I'll sell myself. So this is a person selling himself of their own free will to work as a basically an indentured slave, right? For 5 years, for 10 years, for 2 years. You can pick any time. But a person says, I sign up to work on, in the Panama Canal for a bunch of years in exchange for money. But you're a slave during that time. Okay, now, so says the Gemara, we found that you can sell a person with money if Beit Din is doing it. He's being sold against his will. So basically, he's being treated almost like possessions. But mocher atzmo minalan. How do you know that if you sell yourself voluntarily, you can do it through money? As the Gemara, well, yalev sachir. We learn out the word sachir to tell you that anyone who basically hires themselves out for work, which is a slave in this case, is similar to anybody else. Okay, so it says mishneh schar sachir by a eved that's sold by Beit Din. It says and you become a sachir by where you sell yourself, right? And therefore we compare one to the other. So that is the derivation for comparing a slave who sold himself to a slave who sold by Beit Din. So that's a great proof if you agree with that comparison. That's great if you have sachir. If you don't compare the sachir to sachir, what do you say? Now I'm going to pause for a second and tell you that we're going to discuss this in great detail tomorrow, I think. Later today and tomorrow. Who is this Tana who does not compare sachir to sachir? But before we ask that question, right, how do you then know that a person who sells themselves as a slave can be bought through money? Because the pasuk says, chitasig. If you become, tasig means you achieve riches, right? So if you become richer, then you can buy yourself back. That's musaf al inyan rishon. That's telling you that combines on the first issue. Yomod el yom mitachton. We learn one case from the other. One case is where you sold yourself to a non-Jew, which we already learned can be done through money. The same thing is true if you sell yourself to a Jew, which can also be done through money. So that is how we know that an Eved can be acquired through money. Now, before we go back to our Mishnah and talk about the other ways you acquire an Eved, like a shtar, the Gemara asked the question that's like the interlude that's going to take a lot of time of us, not just today, but tomorrow and maybe beyond. Man Tana de lo yalav sachir. Who is the Tana who does not compare a sachir to a sachir, meaning does not compare a person who is a slave by choice to one who's a slave that's sold by Beit Din? Says Gemara, Hi Tana, it's the following Braita, the Tanya. We have a Braita which says the following: Hamocher atzmo, right? A person who walks into court or to the slave market and says, I want to sell myself. I'm an able-bodied person. I unfortunately have no job. My family's starving. My I don't know, I need to buy off my house. I need $100,000. I'm willing to sell myself to make this money. Okay. So that is mocher atzmo, someone who sells himself. Says the Braita, if you sell yourself, nimkar l'sheish, you by default are sold for 6 years if you don't say anything, but you can also be sold yeter al sheish. If you go in and say, I need $1 million, I'll give you my services for 20 years, right? You can sell yourself for more than 6 years. It's choice. You can choose whatever you want. But if you're machru beitin, if you're sold by court, then einu nimkar el l'sheish. As the pasuk implies, the court can only sell you for up to 6 years. You can't be forced for your debts to work for more than 6 years. So that's one difference between those two. That's one part of the Braita. Continues the Braita. If you sell yourself, there's no question of this banging a hole in your ear and working till Yovel. That doesn't apply by someone who sold themselves. But if you're machru beitin, nirtza. If you're sold by beitin, that's where the pasuk in Mishpatim goes through the whole halacha, that if after 6 years you say, I love my master, I want to stay, you get banged in the ear and you become a slave till Yovel. That's a second difference. A third one, mocher atzmo ein manikin lo. This is very interesting. A person who sells themselves, when they leave, they don't get paid a bonus. Manik means like I think it's probably we translated today, right? You don't get extra money from the owner. But if you're machru beitin, then manikin lo. When you leave the employ of your owner, when you're freed as a slave, you get a gift to go out. Remember, the Torah talks about this. We're going to discuss later, not today, what that gift is. Is it just like a token? Is it one pair? They give you, I think now in jail, right? One pair, a bus ticket, right? It's not much of a gift. But like there's halacha, we're going to see that the owner has to give you like a going away, a startup fund almost when you leave slavery. And we'll see that only applies to someone who's sold against their will. That's a third difference. A fourth difference is hamocher atzmo ein rabo moser lo shifcha kinanit. This is very interesting, right? That a person who's a slave, this is a fascinating detail, which we talked about a lot in Yevamot and elsewhere, that a slave is a Jew, is allowed to sleep with a non-Jew, right? Normally, a Jew is not allowed to sleep with a non-Jew, a shifcha, not just a non-Jew, but a slave. But a Jewish slave is allowed to, or has to, if the owner wants him to, sleep with a shifcha Kanaanit. Remember, shifcha Kanaanit is partially Jewish, right? She's owned by and converted by the Jewish owner, but she's still a Kanaanit. She's not, completely Jewish. So a slave is allowed to sleep with that person, and we know that the Torah talks about that. But that's only true if Beit Din sold you, right? If you sell yourself, you are ein rabo moser lo shifcha Kanaanit. Your owner cannot give you over to marry a shifcha. So a person might say, I really like this shifcha. Let me go sell myself to this owner to do it. You can't do that. But if machru Beit Din, if Beit Din sold you, then rabo moser lo shifcha Kanaanit, then your owner can make you have a relationship with a shifcha Kanaanit to make babies, right? Now, interestingly, that's Rashi's pshat that I just told you. There's many Rishonim who disagree with Rashi, and they say it's not a question of whether you can or cannot. It's a question of whether you have to or don't have to. Meaning, according to the other Rishonim, if you're a shifcha, if you're an eved who's sold by Beit Din, you have to sleep. It's part of your job description, right? And the Torah talks about that, right? You have to work during the day and work otherwise at night by helping him have more babies. But if you're sold on your own, then you don't have to do it. You basically sold yourself for labor. If you want to, you possibly can, according to other Rishonim, but you don't have to. Rashi disagrees with that. Rashi says you're not allowed to. Okay, those are 4 cases that are different between mocher atzmo and someone who's sold by Beit Din. Says Reb Elazar, I disagree with all of them. Right? Zev v'zev, both of them, eino nimkar l'sheish. You can only sell them for 6 years. Zev v'zev nirtza. Both types of slaves, you knock them in the ear if they want to stick around, right? Zev v'zev manikim lo. They both get a bonus when they are freed from their slavery. Zev v'zev rabo moser lo shifcha Kanaanit, and both of them can be given or allowed to or have to sleep with the shifcha Kanaanit if their owner wants them to. So now, clearly, the Tanna Kama holds that there's a lot of differences between these 2 classes of slaves, and Rabbi Elazar says there's no difference, right? So my lav b'hakamiflagi, it must be that the machloka between them is whether you use the word sachir to compare slavery that's by choice or slavery that's forced on you. Tanakama lo yalev sachir sachir. Tanakama says there's no comparison. Each one has its own rules, and therefore they're very different in many ways. And Rebbe Lazar yalev sachir sachir. Rebbe Lazar says that you do compare them to each other. So that seems to be the reason, the source basically of this argument, right? Where are we? So like 10 lines from the bottom, right? 12 lines from the bottom. So that seems to be the difference. Says Rav Tefumi, in the name of Abaya, I disagree. It's not necessarily the case that the reason Rebbe Lazar and Tanakama disagree is because they hold Sachir Sachir or don't hold a Sachir Sachir. It could be the Kuli Alma Yalif Sachir Sachir. Everybody, including Rebbe Lazar, including the Tanakama, hold that you compare a Sachir, a hired hand of a slave who's forced by Beit Din, to a slave by choice. But these are, each one of these is a specific miyat from the pasuk. Hacha, the high krakimiflagi. Here they're arguing about how you specifically read the following psukim. Okay, so let's go through one at a time. I don't think we're going to get through all of them. My time at the Tanakama. What's the reason of the Tanakama? Mocher atzmo nimkar l'sheish v'yater al sheish. Why does he say, the Tanakama, that unlike a person who's sold by Beit Din, who's only sold for up to 6 years, if you sell yourself voluntarily, it could be for 6 years or 20 years or more than 6 years. That's because there's a specific pasuk. The pasuk says, "Miut rachmana gabi micharu Beit Din." When we're talking about where Beit Din sells a person, it says, "Va'avadcha sheish shanim." He will serve you 6 years, implying zeh, only this person. We're learning from avadcha below mocher atzmo. Only this slave, not a different type of slave. So usually we compare them, but here the Torah says not to compare them. This says Rebbe Lazar, what do you mean? Idach, avadcha means lecha v'lo liyoresh. Avadcha means that he's a slave for you, but not for your children, right? And that children don't necessarily inherit a slave. Now, it's much more complicated than this, of course, because sometimes children do inherit a slave. We're going to discuss this as we go on, but there's a difference between a son, who generally inherits a slave, and every other Yorish, a father, a brother, a daughter, right? They don't necessarily inherit a slave. So that's what the word avadcha tells you, according to Rabbi Elazar. Idach. So what does the Tanakama say? Well, it says avadcha twice. Avadcha achriniktiv. It says avadcha 2 times. And therefore, one is to tell you only a slave forced by Beit Din works for 6 years. And the second is to exclude a Yoresh. Idach. What does Rabbi Elazar say? Well, ahu lahartzat adon hudata. The reason it says avadcha a second time is to tell you that only your slave gets hartzah. Only your slave gets money when they leave from working, but someone who chose to work doesn't necessarily get that money. So that is another use of the word avadcha. Okay, I think we should stop here. Actually, yeah, I'm going to stop here. I think because we now go into the next case, which is how you know nirtza, banging in the ear, happens to one and not to the other. But again, it's one of these very sort of long discussions. So we're going to go through. So I just did the first one, which is working for 6 years or more than 6 years. Remember, there are 4 cases that they disagreed about in the Breita, right? One is working for 6 years or more. Second is nirtza, banging a hole in the ear. Third is giving money when they leave at the end of the slavery. And the fourth is whether the slave has to sleep or can sleep with a shifcha kenanit, right? In all those cases, Rabbi Elazar said there's no difference between a slave by choice and a slave forced by Beit Din. And the Tanakama said there is a difference. And we're going to go through one at a time to find the psukim to try to indicate why they disagree. But the first one was avadcha sheishanim. Only if Beit Din forces an eved do they work 6 years, according to the Tanakama. But if Beit Din does not make it happen and happens by choice, then it could be even more than 6 years, again, according to the Tanakama. We'll continue this whole discussion tomorrow, but stop for today. Shikoch, everyone. Shavua Tov.
Quick question.
Yes.
The Rabbi Elazar here, is that Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua? It's obviously a Tana.
It is a Tana, clearly, because it's a Breita, but I don't know.
There are a lot of people with names similar to that.
Yeah, the commentary, at least on the side of my Gemara, has a whole discussion on whether it's Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Elazar, and it
Oh,
says
wow. Okay. That would make a big difference. Yeah.
yeah, and it says there's a Tosfot that discusses it later on in Daf Ayin Vav, Tet Vav, sorry. So
Okay.
that's tomorrow. So I
right.
don't know. I guess we can find this Tosfot and discuss it, but I'm not sure which Rabbi Elazar it is.
Got it. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, everyone, have a good day. Thanks for
Have a good day.
accommodating the earlier time.
Thank you.